we wait, please use the chat to tell us where you're tuning in from and what you hope to learn, questions that you have. My name's Karen Luthi, and I'm the Community Engagement Manager at Maine Center for Economic Policy. And today we're talking about the moral and economic case for land return. So last month, MECEP released a brand new report on that topic, and we hope you'll spend a little time with it. We'll drop that link in the chat. And our guests joining us today are going to provide their own perspective on this issue as Wabanaki citizens and as leaders and as people working to make land return a reality. We're going to get into some of the historical context to set the stage, talk about some of the ways the state has profited from stolen lands, the economic impact of the settlement, options for facilitating land return, and legislative opportunities coming up in the next session. So joining us today, we have Maulian Bryant, citizen of the Penobscot Nation, also Wabanaki Alliance Executive Director. Suzanne Greenlaw, she's from the Holton Band of Maliseet Indians. She's an ecologist, writer, and traditional harvester. James Mile is my colleague, and he's an economic policy analyst here at MECEP and the author of the report. Richard Silboy, yay, he's here. From Mi'kmaq Nation, former Mi'kmaq Nation vice chief, and also a very amazing basket maker. Lucas St. Clair is the chair of the board for the Trust for Public Land and also the Elliotsville Foundation. And Dwayne Toma of the Passamaquoddy tribe. He's a language keeper and culture bearer. And all of you are here who we hope will stay engaged with questions and feedback by using the chat. If you haven't yet had a chance, please feel free to introduce yourself there and tell us where you're joining from. And we hope to have some time for Q&A at the end. We have prepared a very big and dense conversation today, and getting through it is going to be interesting. So we're going to do our best to talk about a lot of things. So for those of you who aren't familiar with MECEP, we are really glad you're here. Our goal is to make sure everyone within Maine's borders has a fair chance at a good life. We study the economy, we conduct research, share ideas, and work with others to advance economic justice and tax fairness in Maine. So what we're talking about today, how returning land to its traditional stewards is an inseparable part of acknowledging the Wabanaki Nation's inherent sovereignty, is also a matter of economic justice. So we at MECEP are committed to prioritizing this work, to continuing to absorb and share knowledge, and most importantly, to taking action that advances that cause. So we are going to tell you how you can join us in that effort, and keep dropping your questions in the chat. So diving in, oh my God, we're right on time. James, can you start by giving us a quick tour of the report and talking about why it was necessary?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. So we wanted to put together the report, partly just we wanted to make the case that tribal sovereignty is an important issue, not just for members of the Wabanaki Nations, but also for Mainers as a whole. And we wanted to really tie the case to economic opportunity for everyone, as you say, everyone within Maine's borders. So in the report, we lay out kind of a few different sections. We talk, and some of that I think we'll go over in this presentation, but we talk about kind of the historical context, kind of the long sort of hundreds of years of history between Wabanaki Nations and Mainers of European descent. We also talk about kind of how that led to the Settlement Act in 1980, the kind of fundamental problems that created. And then we kind of move on to talk about kind of how the status quo is kind of holding Maine and holding the nations back, and how tribal nations in other parts of the United States and in Canada have really seen much more opportunity to exercise their inherent sovereignty, and how that's created kind of economic opportunities, not just for those nations, but also for the communities surrounding them. We give some examples of that. And then we kind of move on to kind of putting a finer point on the state's moral and financial obligations to kind of fix the status quo, and we offer up some ideas to do that. And I think hopefully this is kind of lays the groundwork to talking about how land in particular and sovereignty around land is kind of essential for economic prosperity, and how the state and tribal nations can sort of move forward as partners in recognizing sovereignty and in economic development.
Thank you. So one of the things that I really love about the report is that it takes a pretty deep dive on the historical context, setting the stage for how we got to where we are today. And Maulian, I'm wondering if you can just help the folks with us today understand why it's really important to always provide that historical context, and why we need to look so far back to really understand where we are with land issues today.
Oh, absolutely. And great to be here with you all. A wonderful panel. Thanks for having us all. So, this part is so important. We talk a lot about the changes we need to make here in the state of Maine and the sort of restrictions under this 1980 Settlement Act and the ramifications and the lasting negative consequences from that act on the Wabanaki people. And I think a lot of times we hear one of two things: either you made a deal, accept it, this is done. Or if you knew it was a bad deal, why did you agree to it? If the writing was on the wall that this was going to harm the recognition of our sovereignty. And the historical context is so important because looking at this report, just the maps throughout where you see the loss of land, and then the spotlight on the trauma throughout the generations taking many different forms. When you think about 90% of a people dying off in a fairly short amount of time, then you move into this era of the loss of the land and the taking of the land, really. Loss almost feels too passive, and the conditions around that. And then you move into this real climate of our people had all of their life ways disturbed. You couldn't go catch fish for your sustenance. You couldn't go hunt. You couldn't go in your migratory patterns that had been there for thousands and thousands of years. All of that was disrupted. And this creates an atmosphere where the people are needing to look for ways to survive, to provide for communities. And you have the state of Maine really take advantage of that and insert itself in a way to shield from the wrongdoings, shield themselves from this theft and never account for that, really. And then they can sort of seem like the savior. They come in and they put Indian agents in reservations telling us how we can spend money and where we can go and what we can buy and what we can eat. Then you have the introduction of government rations of food. And when you have folks that can't go catch the fish anymore, it spells out in the report, they had been pleading with folks in Bangor and other areas, stop fishing, overfishing our waters. There's none left for us. So when you have these shipments of lard, cheese, flour, sugar, all of these things that lead to our decline in health and increase of diabetes, heart disease, all these other things, you have a people by the 1970s really looking for some solutions. And we had this Jimmy Carter effect, who was in office and likely to sign something, make something happen, open to helping settle all this. And then the writing was on the wall that Ronald Reagan would be coming in after him, not as friendly, not as open to solutions, and also made some comments that would lead folks to believe that they would look at taking away federal recognition of the tribes here, which was established in order to pursue the land claims court case. So there's a lot on the line for these tribal leaders, and I never want it to seem like the Wabanaki Alliance or anybody now is coming in to fix that or try to make things better because those folks made a bad decision. I think they made the best choice they could have in that time. And you have to think about the generations of trauma and state paternalism and abuse that had led us up to the 1970s, where it's like, here's a deal, you might not get a better one. You might lose your recognition status. So let's work on things in the future if it comes back to be a problem. So I think all that historical context is so good. And then looking at the actual settlement and what the tribes actually got, because I think folks hear the number 81.5 million, that's so much money. You guys are all set for life. And when you look at the actual settlement and what those funds can be used for, and that none of the tribes have even gotten the amounts of land we're supposed to in the settlement. So even that bare minimum land hasn't been dealt with, and then you have all these sovereignty restrictions in there. It is a bad deal, and there's a lot of reasons for why it came to be. And this report does a wonderful job, even if it's sad for some of us to read, of how our rights were chipped away over time, and how a lot of these things weren't huge takings or big devastating events. It was like death by 1,000 cuts. And this really spells that out in a good way.
Yeah, death by 1,000 cuts is a really good way of describing it. Let's sort of, I'd really like to, because what's at the heart of a lot of the land loss from colonization stems from you know, totally different ways of thinking about the world. And Suzanne, I'm hoping you can kind of paint a picture for us of how Wabanaki people cared for the land before colonization and some of those indigenous ways of stewardship.
Sure, great, thank you. Well, in truth, we don't fully know exactly how we cared for the large landscape of Wabanaki, right? Like, it's been 300 years or 400 years since we've been able to employ our caretaking rules across that landscape. We do know that when Europeans came here, there was an abundance of forest tracklands that were much larger than what they see today. The trees were much larger. We had more abundance, healthier rivers and estuaries, more fish, right? It was all those natural resources that Europeans had, fished out or damaged within their own homelands, that they then came to here in search of sort of all of these like new things. But and I think we often got painted in the past as just sort of like as children on the landscape that didn't know any better, and these things were just there, right? Which is a fallacy. And I think it was a fallacy in place to kind of then harvest or take from us the idea that we weren't caring for these places, but actually it was our ways of being that were creating these environments. And so, and I think that form of stewardship is seen today, or caretaking is seen today, in how we harvest the lands we are able to manage. For example, in black ash harvesting, right, we have an approach that is able to benefit the health of the landscape. We harvest in the same locations every couple of years. We don't harvest it out where we can't come back to that landscape. It maintains its ecological functions, for all those kind of Western science metrics of value in those spaces. It benefits those values. Nobody owns the land as one person and restricts other people from coming. So it's a collective management. And so we can, like, 8 people can be in the same location and harvest together without feeling like they have to harvest over the other person. So I think these are kind of the values that exist within the way we care for the landscape, that is also more about 7 generations, or like caring for the future, right? So it's future for ourselves. It's not taking what we can now and forgetting about the future. It's caring for ourselves so that in 7 years, we can come back here to harvest and still support the livelihood and our thriving communities. So I think those are different approaches to caretaking. And I know one thing as well is the sort of migration, the idea of seasonal migration. And I always kind of bristle at that sort of statement, because I think sometimes that sees us as like, we always move, but I think there's a lot of people, a lot of scholars like James Francis talks about the sort of sense of home. It's not that we moved all the time, is that our sense of home was broad, but I actually find that to be true for many people today as well. Like some people live someplace and then move someplace else for the summer, right? Like that is our sense of home is kind of broad. The same for us. It was that fact that we, I think, sourced a lot of our cultural materials, our building, everything we used was within our areas. So our sense of care, I think, of the landscape was different and more expansive than what we see today. I think those are kind of the key differences.
Yeah, thank you. Richard, how about can you talk a little bit about how deals were made between tribes before settlers arrived and how how the tribes did trade and recorded their agreements? Oh, you're on mute.
Okay. Could you repeat that question?
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about how deals were made between tribes before colonization and how negotiations were and trade was recorded?
Yeah, there wasn't a whole lot that was recorded that I know of prior to colonization, but the tribes would hunt together and get together during the spring or the fall, and they would work together to harvest whatever they needed for food, and also to they'd use the same trade routes that the tribes had used, right from the beginning, and today, we still use those same rivers to paddle our canoes and stuff. So it's very important for the tribes to work together, and I believe that the coming of the white man only brought us together a little tighter because of the battles that the Wabanaki people fought. Some sided with the French, some sided with the British. So it was just a very difficult time for the Wabanaki people, and hopefully, we can get through this sovereignty issue and and become self-sufficient, a lot more than we have been. Suzanne mentioned the poverty that we went through, and the government, giving us food. The only thing the government gave us is, everything that they gave us was bad for our health. The cheese and that meat, and although we was glad to receive it at the time, but looking back on it now, it was just very devastating for our health. And I don't know. I'm sure that it still affects some of us. I've had major heart attacks and diabetes and the whole 9 yards for it. But and the tribes working together, fishing together, and just gathering for treaties, and the Wabanaki Confederacy that we've always worked at, and hopefully that we can continue to do that. So
Thanks in large part to the work of the Wabanaki Alliance.
yeah.
Yeah. Dwayne, set us up for worlds colliding here with there's really fundamental cultural differences between oral versus written communication, communal usage versus individual and corporate ownership, and resource exploitation versus sustainable stewardship, and how that kind of is really fueled by the adoption of the doctrine of discovery, which I know you're really an expert in talking about, and leading us up to kind of where we land as the U.S. is created as a new nation. And so give us a sense of how that, and knowing that we are starting to run a little bit beyond our time, but trying to tee up this understanding of how the land loss starts with the doctrine of discovery really fueling that.
Yes, thank you so much for allowing me to be able to articulate some of the history when it comes to some of those systems. First of all, we got to remember Gijiji Tundama Guji Beji, Gijiji Tunch Dama Eliain. In our language means once we get to understand where we come from, we'll know where we're going. So we got to take it back and talk about the ideologies, talk about the methodologies, and talk about the archaic barbaric laws that were instituted to be able to carry out these genocidal principles, all to talk about 500 years in 2 minutes. It's very difficult. But I will try to articulate this in its proper context, because we got to remember the category that they put our people in. They're subhuman. Saracens, they're pagans, they're infidels. We must assimilate them. And we must indoctrinate them. And if they don't comply, we must kill them. So this is the language that was used at that time. And once we get to understand the historical systems that are created and continue to be created to carry out these genocidal principles, we are still here because of people coming from here and changing those narratives in society, because they wanted to keep our people subservient. So once we get to understand that system, to keep us down. So it's real important for us to understand that it's a deep, dark history that we must talk about in its proper context. Because systematically, and when we go and get these degrees in these institutions, they don't talk about power and domination. Because you got to remember, the tribes throughout the world do not have title of land, because they do not have a biblical right to own land. And this is the stories and language that's being used, and truth, but people don't know about, but it's designed that way. Once we get to do the research, and I want to mention this gentleman's name because it's very important, that Stephen T. Newcomb has dedicated over 45 years of his life unmasking the domination code at the United Nations level. And this is the kind of things that we need to unveil to the world of systematics. And through this Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement Act, it's all part of that systems of power and domination.
Yeah, and all of the systems are set up for your failure. So, all of the systems are designed to benefit the colonizers, and the legal system and the the way that the treaties were made were all set up to benefit the colonizers. So James, can you kind of quickly link us now with, there's a couple of moments in time that are really truly pivotal to understanding the land claims story here in this area, and that is the after the U.S. was founded, and we've got some important treaties that sort of that demonstrate this acknowledgement of sovereign to sovereign, nation to nation relationship. And then you have this 1790 Non-Intercourse Act, and that is the one that says that only the federal government can enter into treaties, especially about land, with tribal nations. And so after that 1790 treaty, you've got Massachusetts making treaties anyway, and just ignoring that federal law altogether, and understanding that the federal government has, makes a very clear case that they have a trust responsibility to the tribal nations. And so, James, can you just kind of do some connective tissue there, and then talk about how after these treaties were made unlawfully by Massachusetts, that they go on to reap major profit from those stolen lands? If you can kind of connect some dots for us, that would be great.
Yeah, so as you said, Karen, kind of we go through in the report and detail some of the history of kind of relations between, primarily we focus in our report between like the English colonists and the indigenous people, the Wabanaki in Maine, and we look at kind of the development of those relations and some of the diplomatic kind of treaties that were entered into. And kind of importantly, we kind of point to a couple of things that you mentioned there. Kind of by the middle to end of the 18th century, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is entering into treaties with the Wabanaki Nations and kind of recognizing their sovereignty as part of that and engaging with them as kind of sovereign nations. And in many cases, kind of like the recognition of their right to the land and to use the land is more implicit in there, I think, than explicit and laying out specific kind of boundaries. But they do recognize clearly that the Wabanaki Nations have the right to, are the original inhabitants of the land and have the right to use that land. And as you say, kind of importantly, in 1790, the new United States Congress passes a law that says, states are no longer allowed to enter into treaties directly with indigenous peoples. The federal government has to do that. It's a nation-to-nation relationship. And for reasons that are, I think, a little unclear still, the state of Massachusetts, sort of which Maine is a part, continues to make those treaties anyway. And, we chart in the report kind of the ways in which kind of the Wabanaki lands are kind of gradually reduced down to really tiny fractions of what they had been before the Non-Intercourse Act was passed. And the 1980 settlement kind of arose because of a lawsuit that was filed on behalf of the Wabanaki Nations, accusing the state of violating the Non-Intercourse Act. And so that's kind of an important turning point. And the claim that was made under the lawsuit was for around 12 million acres of land. That's about 2/3 of the state of Maine right now. And so we, in the report, we kind of looked at kind of what that area was that was being claimed, or was the subject of the Settlement Act, and then tried to say, well, the Settlement Act tried to put, one version of a price on that land, and we go through kind of the ways in which like the actual money that was awarded under the settlement was inadequate. But we also wanted to look at kind of like what are the ways that, given that first Massachusetts and then Maine continued to enter into these treaties, many of which were kind of coercive or certainly lopsided in one way or another. You know, the ways in which they took a lot of this land without compensation and in violation of federal law. What profit did the state get out of it? So we looked at that in a few different ways. We talk about, you know, there are some ways in which the state directly benefited just by selling the land. You know, millions of acres of land was sold by the state of Maine through about 1870, sometimes to land speculators, sometimes to individuals. And the state obviously made money from that. There were property taxes that were collected, especially through kind of lumber operations. And we talk about the lumber industry, which at one point was Maine's largest industry, and how that really profited from that. And then also things like the use of the waterways, and how that kind of profited the state in terms of trade. And all these things were things that the state kind of extracted more and more wealth from, and did not give any payment to the original Wabanaki inhabitants. And we know that, you know, kind of contrary to that, they both like polluted the natural landscape, and they continued to treat the Wabanaki Nations as kind of wards of the state, and to continue kind of trying to suppress culture and history there. So at the same time that it was profiting a lot from this land that was essentially stolen from the tribes, it was also kind of keeping them down and keeping conditions on the remaining tribal lands very poor. So we talk about kind of, we try and get at in the report the extent to which that is kind of an unpaid debt and an extracted wealth that the state has never repaid to the Wabanaki Nations.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that we hear most often that is not well understood by your average Mainer, is that you know, the state profited off of this stolen land for hundreds of years, 160 years, and did not contribute anything at all when it came to the settlement. So nothing. So not a dime. And I think it's really important to kind of underscore that. And then also to, the other thing that's not really well understood, and Dwayne, I'm hoping you can, I know this is something we could spend a whole hour talking about all on its own, but how the settlement went a bit sideways. And I know it's a tricky thing to talk about because at the time, you know, the context of what was happening at the time was, you know, important to understand. There was a lot of pressure to settle out of court. This really a major land claims case. It was very different, as Maulian was saying, it was a different climate for talking about these issues. But can you, Dwayne, and Richard, also feel free to jump in as well, because the Mi'kmaq Nation was really left out of a lot of these talks, and so that is a whole kind of separate ball of wax. But can you talk a little bit about how the settlement went a little sideways, Dwayne?
Yes, and really, it really comes down to cementing in our gains. That's exactly what happened at that particular time, to really cement in our gains and to really be able to have more control, because we actually had a legitimate claim to 2/3 of the state of Maine. So that really put the owners up in arms at that time, because they thought that the Indians were going to steal their land. So it's real important for us to recognize in this proper context what actually happened there. So it was really basically it's really was really shoved down our throats. I don't know how to put it in its proper context, but either you do it or you get nothing, you know. So it was really and then they made some last minute provisions to be able to even cement in their gains even more. So it was really consistent with historical patterns of power and domination. So they really didn't want the tribes to be able to have any legal jurisdiction or any really say on territories. So I mean, even they cited a lot of jurisdictional issues regarding the Penobscot River. Those are all recent court cases, you know, but that just simply was all about domination.
Yeah, and that during the external review process of this report, it was we were reminded of that element about provisions being inserted at the very end of the process of the settlement that were not approved by the tribes, and that really led to the state taking a completely different perspective on their power, their control. And so I think a lot of that is still kind of unknown. But I do want to get into, because I'm sorry not to spend more time on this, but we're a little bit behind on our timing. And I do want to get into land return and talk about what options we have and start talking about some of the ways that we can really take action on this and start to move in this direction of land return. So can you, James, and to our guests, please feel free to jump in, because there are some good examples to talk about. And the Wabanaki Commission in particular, and First Light, has done so much work on this issue, not only in securing land for return, but re-educating people on this issue and really helping people to understand that it is time to think about this, about conservation differently and thinking about land return differently. And so James, talk to us about the options, and we go over a lot of this in the report too. So public, private, most land is held privately here in Maine. So what's the lay of the land, literally?
Yeah, so we look in the report at a few different kind of ways of land return, and also a concept of co-stewardship. I mean, a number of states there is increasingly, and I think at the federal level too, there's some increasing momentum around sort of straight up land return, returning land to the original indigenous inhabitants. And we also talk in the report about like some of the benefits of this are, harnessing and making use of like the indigenous folks' ability to, or like literally thousands of years of experience of managing this land, and kind of the benefits that brings to all of us. And so we do talk about some examples there, but as you noted, kind of Maine is a little unusual in that around 95% of the land in Maine is privately owned. So while we point to some prominent examples, around Katahdin and Acadia, where these are also regions that have special significance for Wabanaki people. And, the federal government has engaged in some projects around sort of what they talk about as co-stewardship of land, where they sort of enter into partnerships with indigenous folks. We also talk about kind of the need for facilitating kind of private land return as well. And so, part of that is sort of legal and regulatory, making it easier. Some of the conditions imposed on the Settlement Act mean that legislative approval is required before Wabanaki Nations can acquire more trust fund, and that often kind of creates a bottleneck. And sometimes there are bottlenecks at the local level as well. But we also really point to the kind of the need for more funding for Wabanaki Nations to be able to do that. Fundamentally, the Settlement Act provided money for the idea of purchasing land as a way of land return. But we point to some of the ways in which kind of like the amount that was calculated under the Settlement Act was inadequate, and kind of the price of land has risen dramatically since 1980. And as we've also sort of talked about, like the state has kind of this financial moral obligation to be funding some of this as well. So there are some kind of legal things the state could do to kind of get out of the way and make it easier for Wabanaki Nations to purchase land, for returning land that way from private owners. But there's also kind of a financial component to it as well. So that's kind of some of the high level view that we sort of looked at for
that. Great. I want to bring Lucas St. Clair into the conversation now, because you have been directly involved in some of these land return projects. And can you fill us in on what the Elliottsville Foundation has been doing, and the very, very large parcel that is in process for being returned, and just talk about how your thinking about this issue has evolved over time?
Great. Well, thanks for the question and thanks for including me in the panel. As I sort of my journey in land conservation began, I thought a lot about figures like Isaac Walton and Henry David Thoreau and Theodore Roosevelt and this kind of Western conservation construct, and really celebrated that view of protecting land. And as I worked on Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument and then ultimately completed that project, I started working more closely with Wabanaki community members, and my perspective on land conservation and land protection began to change pretty dramatically in thinking about, rather than protecting land or conserving land, it's developing relationship with land and with the things that are on that land and rely on that land. And as that understanding developed, I thought a lot more about how land management is considered. And if we consider land management through the lens of relationship, as opposed to trying to extract one very specific thing, there can be a much more dynamic ecosystem that is developed. And so my the way land back was first entered into my mind was with First Light. And my brother-in-law was actually at a First Light session where John Banks was describing a wealthy female conservationist that had offered some land to be returned to the Penobscot Nation that hadn't come to fruition. And my brother-in-law called me and he said, "I think John Banks was talking about your mom, and you might want to touch base with him to see what he's talking about." And so I reached out to him and he said, "Yeah, we own land and right by land that you own, and there's a road that crosses it that would make it really convenient if we had access to the road." It was 600 acres or so. And so we decided just to give that 600 acres to the Penobscot Nation. And it was very easy to do. And it felt like a real relief to be able to start directing some of the assets that our family owned in the form of land to the original caretakers and the original relations to that land. And so we started thinking about how to do it more and how to do it at scale. And that's where the Wasatic project first emerged. It was this 30,000 acre parcel south of Katahdin Woods and Waters, was owned by a TIMO, and they offered to sell it. And I worked with an organization that I sit on the board with, the Trust for Public Land, and we ultimately were able to purchase that that land with borrowed money, and with the intention of raising the money to pay back our loans. And once we raised the money, we would transfer the land to the Penobscot Nation. And we've been working on that project for a few years now. I think we're probably 4 years into it. It'd be the largest transfer of land from an NGO to a tribal nation in the history of our country. And it's a really exciting thing for me because, as James said, Maine is very private. There are a lot of private land here. And so while that poses some challenge for a cohesive management and cohesive planning to take place across a large intact landscape, it does provide some advantages to talk to individual landowners. And in the case of Maine, some of those individual landowners control large parcels of land. And so with this project, it would be contiguous with other conserved land, including Baxter Park and Katahdin Woods and Waters, that will draw people to the region. And one of the opportunities that I see is that when people are drawn to this region for outdoor recreation and learning history, what they'll learn more than I think any other place in the Northeast is, with the exception of tribal communities, is an indigenous worldview. And really that's been a goal of our foundation and the community that I work in, that people that visit Maine and are able to experience indigenous culture and learn this relationship and stories from from Indigenous communities. And I think it will begin, and I think it already has begun, a real transformation in the way people are thinking about those relations. Certainly, a decade ago, I don't think these conversations like this weren't happening, and I think they're continuing to evolve and become more present. So it's a really wonderful evolution. Certainly, there are some political headwinds, as we all know, but there is progress amongst those political headwinds, and I'm excited to see more land be transferred to Native community, not just here in Maine, but all across the country. And for those that are concerned that there are no encumbrances, easements, and things put on land before it's transferred to Native community, I think a really important thing to understand is about 80% of the biodiversity on our planet is on the 5% of land that's managed by Indigenous people. And so the track record, just from a data standpoint, certainly shows that our planet is a much healthier place when the land is managed by Native communities. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And also, I do want to let people know who are, watching this and wondering, how, what you can do personally, that the money is still being raised to pay off the loan for that parcel of land before it can be turned over to the Penobscot Nation, and anyone can contribute to that fund. So it's a really great way that if you want to participate in that, in actually helping to fund a land return project, you can find more about that at Trust for Public Lands website, and I think you can get there through the Dawnland, through the First Light website too, that's in the chat. And I want to make sure that we leave some time for getting the questions that we're seeing in the chat in. But Suzanne, before we talk about the legislative opportunities, are there any successful examples of co-stewardship that we should know about?
Yeah. Well, it depends on your definition of success. And I think there's probably a
Good
scale
point.
of what that looks like. And as Lucas just mentioned, I think the best form of co-stewardship is land return. I think I scale it on versions of like, how restricted are we in these agreements? And we do have examples, because not everybody's going to return land. That's right. And so the current landholder, are there relationships that can be formed with a version of co-stewardship? And I think that some of our best ones are actually with a private forest landholder who doesn't make us required to do anything other than we can go harvest there. And there's, I think oftentimes those restrictions that are forms of control that Dwayne talks about a little bit too. I mean, his control was much more deeper, but the conservation in some ways are also tools of control against Native people. And it starts off with this sort of distrust approach, like the idea that they're using their Western framework of assumptions of extraction against us, when actually our examples are not that. Our examples are much more of abundance and less of scarcity. And so we really prefer places that have the least amount of restrictions and control kind of on the landscape. But we do have parts are working within federal landscapes, and that's really a tribal nation to a federal landscape decision-making place. And I would say I would defer to them and their belief of success in those places.
Yeah. Maulian, can you tell us a little bit about the bills that are in play in the legislature, which will be ramping up again in January, that we want people to be paying attention to, and that the alliances behind? Some of them do really link directly to the policy recommendations that we lay out in this report.
Absolutely. And I'll start in a sad place, and that is we came off of the first year of this session with the governor vetoing a bill, a very narrowly focused bill aimed specifically at protecting tribal lands from eminent domain. So that is just another lasting negative consequence of the Settlement Act, is that the tribes in Maine, we stand to lose land through state eminent domain. And we had a very razor thin focus bill on that, and the governor did veto that. So there wasn't a whole lot of opposition to that, but her office in the veto letter said that they want the option on the table in the future to be able to seize tribal land through eminent domain. And if you look at the maps in the report, you see just how small the areas are that are in tribal stewardship. And this bill would have only been affected or been, overseeing current trust land. So that's an even smaller amount of land. So that was certainly frustrating and disheartening. But we're going into this next year, starting in January, with two pieces of legislation that the Wabanaki Alliance is in favor of. And it's LD 785, which is a bill to put into place the recommendations from a task force from 2019. That was a tribal state collaboration where the tribal chiefs actually participated in that task force with state leaders. And that group recommended a whole host of changes to the Settlement Act. And actually, after that work, the tribal chiefs and leadership came together to form the Wabanaki Alliance. And so the genesis of the Wabanaki Alliance was really from that task force work and the unity of those tribal chiefs and leaders. And then there's also LD 395, which is a bill specifically looking at access to federal Indian law. So one other thing that the state negotiating team was able to insert into the Settlement Act is a provision that blocks the Wabanaki people from accessing laws passed at the federal level meant to benefit federally recognized tribal nations. There have been 151 of these laws passed since 1980. We've gained back access to one of them, and that took us 7 years. And that's the Violence Against Women Act. So we need a shift in our philosophy around how we view the tribal nations in Maine. We are federally recognized. We should have access to those laws. We've gotten a similar effort all the way to the governor's desk on this before, and she has vetoed it. So both of these bills will be in the Judiciary Committee. They're both sponsored by Senator Rachel Talbot Ross, and we are always hopeful that we can get these to the governor, and then we'll see what happens. But we're super thankful for the momentum and the friendships and the alliances and the support around these tribal issues as we go into an election year next year. A lot of candidates are talking about these things, and we're ever thankful for all of the attention on these issues. As you see in the context of our history as Mainers, it matters to everybody.
Yeah. And also for the people wondering as they're watching this, how they can get personally involved, please do go to the Wabanaki Alliance's website, where there will be action items for getting involved in testifying or at rallies, and letters to the editor, ways that you can help uplift these bills that are in play. That is direct action. And I want to, and also Dwayne is going to be talking about the doctrine of discovery tomorrow in Blue Hill at the Blue Hill Library at 5 o'clock, which I'm going to try to go there. So if folks want to continue talking about this with Dwayne, with me, like, come to that, let's talk. And okay, I'm so sorry that we only have a few minutes for questions, but let's try to get at some of these. So Heidi asks, how can we get sovereignty stability when we get such differences of opinion in different states and nations and in different governmental administrations?
I can offer that. I think what cuts through a lot of division is good storytelling and bringing up what relates to us as human beings. So yesterday we had an election. Question 1 had some ramifications around tribal ID, and I saw that issue really resonate with folks, even though there's not that many of us tribal people in Maine. But I saw that really motivate people to learn more about that, and the question did fail overwhelmingly. And I heard from a lot of people that they were concerned about ramifications on tribal ID. So that's something that is outside of the parties or who's behind anything. And I think when you tell a good story and you bring people in and it's about humanity, that's part of how we can kind of wade through the division in the country.
Wayne, there's
And
a question directed at you about the reference for the person doing research work at the UN level.
yes, that was Stephen T. Newcomb.
And also just to let people know that we'll be doing a follow-up email, and we're going to have resources and try to also maybe, if we can, answer some of these questions there that we run out of time for. Rod says, the thrust of the issues with the Settlement Act seem to be about misuse of promised funds and so much less land being returned to Wabanaki tribes than planned. How did the Wabanaki tribes lose federal recognition and all the benefits of that in the process of the Settlement Act development agreement? I don't think that we have time to really talk about. Whew, that's a big one, and I think we could do a whole webinar on that. But if anybody wants to take a quick bite at that, please.
I will just say we didn't lose federal recognition, but we lost the recognition of our rights as federally recognized tribes. So that's an important distinction. We are federally recognized, but because of the Settlement Act and the way it's been interpreted, those rights have been able to be really weakened, I think, by state power.
Right. And one of the things that, it's laid out in the report how the funds that were the federal funds that were set aside for the tribes to buy back some of the land that was lost was just not enough. And also it didn't keep up with inflation. The cost of land now is many, many, many times more than it was when the settlement was made, and also tons of restrictions to many roadblocks in actually acquiring land. So it took way longer. There wasn't enough money, and it was just a very cumbersome process. But yes, Maulian is totally right that the tribes are still all federally recognized, and they have inherent sovereignty, and that is the thing that we should always be remembering when we're talking about this issue, that sovereignty doesn't disappear, and that sovereignty is not granted by the federal government or by anybody else. It is inherent. So I think that we are out of time. I'm so sorry that we couldn't get to more of these questions. It at least shows how engaged people are here. And I just want to thank everyone for being with us. Thank you so much. Please do reach out to us at info@MECEP.org for general inquiries. And the webinar has been recorded today, and we'll share it out, and we'll also try to put more resources in that follow-up. And I really want to thank everyone who was our guest here today. This conversation has been so great, and I hope we can keep it going as we move into the next legislative session and beyond. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.